Miranda Hall was a name that carried weight, even in the corridors of law enforcement, where egos often overshadowed integrity. She had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the ranks of the police force, breaking barriers as one of the few black women to reach the position of police chief. Her reputation for fairness, unwavering discipline, and strategic brilliance preceded her. But for Miranda, her recent appointment to lead the embattled city's police department wasn't a moment of triumph, it was a calculated gamble. The city she had moved to was no stranger to scandal. Its police force was riddled with controversies ranging from unchecked corruption to allegations of systemic racism. The community's trust in law enforcement was at an all-time low, and the department's officers had grown used to operating with a dangerous level of autonomy. Miranda knew that turning things around wouldn't be a matter of policies or directives alone. Real change would require rooting out the old culture starting from its most stubborn adherents. Miranda chose to approach her new role quietly, avoiding the usual pomp and ceremony that might accompany the arrival of a new chief. Instead of a flashy welcome, she opted for humility. She purchased a modest fixer-upper in a working-class neighborhood, nothing fancy, just a sturdy old house with good bones and the potential to become a home. For Miranda, the decision was symbolic. By living among the people most affected by the failings of the system, she hoped to understand their frustrations firsthand. The house, however, needed serious renovations. Contractors came and went throughout the week, tearing out rotting beams, patching walls, and hauling materials in and out. Though Miranda occasionally stopped by to oversee the work, she largely kept her distance, preferring to give the workers space to do their job. She visited at odd hours, dressed casually, blending into the neighborhood without drawing attention to herself. To the untrained eye, she looked like any other resident, not the city's top cop. It was a deliberate choice. Unbeknownst to Miranda, her unassuming presence was about to set the stage for an explosive encounter with Officer Harry Wilson, one of the department's most problematic figures. Wilson had spent over a decade in the force, but instead of rising through the ranks, his career had stagnated. His record was littered with minor reprimands, ranging from insubordination to excessive use of force. Despite this, he remained on the force, protected by an old guard of superiors who turned a blind eye to his behavior. Wilson's bitterness festered, and his biases were often thinly veiled behind the guise of instinct. Wilson was patrolling the neighborhood on an otherwise uneventful afternoon when his gaze fell on Miranda's house. He slowed his squad car as he noticed a delivery truck parked out front, its rear doors wide open. Workers were unloading materials, wood, drywall, and other construction supplies, stacking them neatly in the driveway. From his vantage point, Wilson could see the half-gutted interior of the house through the open front door. A woman, dressed in worn jeans and a plain shirt, was speaking with one of the workers, pointing toward the roofline as if giving instructions. To Wilson, the scene looked suspicious. The woman didn't fit the image he had in mind for a homeowner in this area. It was subtle but unmistakable. His biases began to color his perception. To him, she was out of place. He pulled his patrol car to the curb and sat for a moment, watching. His mind raced with assumptions. Was the house abandoned? Was she squatting? Was this some sort of unreported construction site violating city codes? The thoughts piled up, none of them grounded in fact, but all fueled by his own prejudice. Without calling for backup or notifying dispatch, Wilson made a snap decision. He would handle it himself. He wasn't interested in following protocol or verifying the situation. He wanted to assert control. His frustration with the slow pace of his career found an outlet in moments like these, opportunities to flex his authority and remind himself that he still had power, even if it was misused. Wilson stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt as he approached the house. His boots crunched against the gravel driveway, drawing the attention of one of the workers. The man straightened, wiping his hands on his overalls, but before he could greet the officer, Wilson waved him off dismissively. "Step back," Wilson barked, his tone sharp and commanding. "What's going on here?" The worker hesitated, glancing toward Miranda, who was standing by the front steps. Miranda looked up, her expression calm but alert. She didn't recognize Wilson, but she could sense the hostility radiating from him. "This is a private property," Miranda said evenly, stepping forward. "Can I help you with something, officer?" Wilson's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "Private property, huh? You got paperwork to prove that?" Miranda raised an eyebrow. "I do, but I'm curious, what exactly are you implying?" Wilson's posture stiffened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who didn't immediately defer to his authority. "This area's been flagged for illegal activity," he said, improvising on the spot. "And I've got a duty to investigate suspicious behavior. A bunch of trucks and strangers unloading who knows what in a neighborhood like this. That's more than enough reason to check things out." The workers exchanged uneasy glances, but Miranda remained composed. She could see exactly what kind of man Wilson was, one who thrived on intimidation and impulsive decisions. "Well, officer, I appreciate your concern," Miranda replied, her voice steady. "But as I said, this is private property, and everything happening here is above board. You're welcome to call it in and confirm." Wilson smirked, a trace of condescension creeping into his expression. "Sure, and while we're at it, why don't you step aside so I can take a look around, just to be thorough?" "That won't be necessary," Miranda said, her tone firming. "I'm the owner of this property, and you don't have a warrant. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but this is getting close to harassment." Wilson's eyes flashed with irritation. "Harassment? Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but I've got the authority here." Miranda held his gaze, unflinching. "And I've got rights. So unless you have something concrete to act on, I suggest you move along." Wilson didn't respond immediately. For a moment, he seemed caught off guard by her confidence. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression, his pride overriding his better judgment. "All right," Wilson said, stepping back. "If that's how you want to play it, let's see how this unfolds." Miranda watched him retreat to his squad car, her instincts telling her this wasn't over. As he drove off, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had dealt with men like Wilson before, arrogant, impulsive, and dangerous when their authority was challenged. But she hadn't expected to face it here, in her new city, before she'd even fully settled in. What Miranda didn't yet know was that Wilson's next move would be far more drastic than she could have imagined. Wilson sat in his squad car, simmering with irritation. The woman's calmness and refusal to submit to his authority gnawed at him. He replayed their interaction in his head, each moment stoking his frustration further. Who did she think she was? Her confidence wasn't the kind he was used to encountering, especially not in this neighborhood. It didn't matter to him that she claimed ownership of the property, or that everything appeared legal on the surface. Something about her set him off, and he wasn't ready to let it go. In his mind, he had made up a narrative that justified his actions. The construction supplies, the activity around the house, and the woman's assertiveness were all pieces of a puzzle that confirmed his unfounded suspicions. Wilson was convinced that this was some kind of illegal operation, whether it was drug-related, unlicensed construction, or even squatting. He didn't need proof. His instincts, biased as they were enough to spur him into action. He picked up his radio and called the city's code enforcement department. It wasn't a direct line, but he had connections there, a friend who owed him a favor. The conversation was brief but effective. Wilson exaggerated the situation, claiming he had encountered an unlicensed construction project on a potentially abandoned property. He suggested that swift action was needed to prevent further violations. The official on the other end, either trusting Wilson or simply not wanting to get involved, processed the request without much pushback. Satisfied, Wilson leaned back in his seat, a grim smile spreading across his face. He had effectively set a chain of events in motion that would allow him to return to the house with city backing. This time, there would be no arguing, no calmly worded refusals. The woman's quiet defiance would be met with force, legal or otherwise. And to make sure she understood who was in charge, Wilson decided to escalate the situation even further. Instead of waiting for code enforcement to follow up, Wilson took matters into his own hands. Through his connection, he secured the use of a city-issued excavator, ostensibly to clear debris and enforce compliance. It was an outrageous move, one that bypassed multiple layers of procedure and oversight. But Wilson didn't care. He was determined to act quickly before anyone had the chance to question his authority. By the time the excavator arrived at the property, the sun was beginning to set. The machine, an imposing piece of equipment with its massive bucket and clanking treads, rolled onto the gravel driveway, drawing the immediate attention of the workers still on site. One of them ran to the front steps, shouting into the house to alert Miranda. She emerged moments later, her expression a mixture of confusion and alarm as she took in the scene. Wilson stood beside the excavator, his arms crossed and a smug look on his face. He didn't bother with pleasantries as Miranda approached him. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice steady but edged with anger. Wilson gestured casually toward the machine. "Just doing my job. Got a report of unlicensed construction and a potentially hazardous structure. City regulations require immediate action." Miranda narrowed her eyes. "Unlicensed. Hazardous. That's a lie and you know it. I've provided all the necessary permits for the renovations and the structure is perfectly safe." Wilson shrugged, feigning indifference. "Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Either way, I've got orders to act. And unless you can prove otherwise right now, this site's being cleared." Miranda took a step closer, her composure barely masking the fury bubbling beneath the surface. "This is an abuse of power, officer. You're not following protocol, and you have no authority to bring in an excavator without a court order." Wilson smirked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Look, lady, I don't make the rules, I just enforce them. If you've got a problem, take it up with the city. In the meantime, you might want to step back. Things are about to get messy." Without waiting for a response, Wilson signaled to the excavator operator, who hesitated briefly before starting the engine. The machine roared to life, its mechanical arm lifting ominously into the air. The workers on site began shouting in protest, but their voices were drowned out by the grinding of gears and the roar of the engine. Miranda's heart raced as she watched the excavator lurch forward, its bucket swinging toward the corner of the house. "Stop this," she shouted, stepping in front of Wilson. "You're crossing every possible line right now. Do you even understand the consequences of what you're doing?" Wilson met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he smirked again, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "The only consequence I see is cleaning up this mess. Now I suggest you move before someone gets hurt." Miranda's mind raced. She had dealt with men like Wilson before, officers who thrived on intimidation and impulsive displays of power. But this was a different level of recklessness. He wasn't just breaking the rules, he was endangering lives and property with no regard for the repercussions. She knew she needed to act quickly, but revealing her true identity at this moment might only escalate the situation further. Instead, she decided to stall him. Fine, Miranda said sharply, stepping back. But I'm documenting everything. This will not go unnoticed. She pulled out her phone and began recording the scene, capturing the excavator's destructive movements as it tore into the side of the house. The sound of splintering wood and crumbling plaster filled the air, each strike a brutal assault on what was supposed to be her safe haven. Workers scrambled to salvage what they could, pulling tools and materials out of harm's way, but it was clear the damage would be extensive. Wilson watched her with a smug satisfaction, clearly enjoying her visible frustration. "Go ahead and record," he said. "It's not going to change anything. By the time this is over, there won't be much left to argue about." Miranda clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to lose control, not when Wilson was so clearly feeding off the power dynamic he thought he held over her. Instead, she focused on gathering evidence, photos, videos, and testimonies from the workers who were now witnesses to the unfolding chaos. As the excavator continued its assault, Wilson moved closer to Miranda, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "You know, you could have avoided all this if you'd just cooperated earlier. But no, you had to make it difficult. Guess you'll think twice next time." Miranda turned to face him, her expression steely. "The only thing I'll be thinking about is how to make sure you're held accountable for every single thing you've done here." Wilson's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered, brushing off her words. "Good luck with that," he muttered, stepping back toward the excavator. Miranda watched him go, her mind already formulating her next move. This wasn't just about the destruction of her property, it was about exposing the kind of unchecked behavior that had plagued the department for years. And as she stood amidst the chaos, surrounded by the remnants of her once promising home, she knew one thing for certain: Wilson had no idea who he was dealing with. The sound of the excavator tearing into the corner of the house was deafening, and Miranda felt a sharp pang of anger and helplessness as she watched debris fly into the air. The workers who had been assisting with the renovation were shouting now, some trying to move tools and supplies to safety, while others simply stood in disbelief. One of them, a middle-aged man named Reggie, had been in the middle of repainting the window frames when the chaos began. Now, with paint still dripping from his brush, he rushed up to Miranda. "Mom, this is insane," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with outrage. "They're destroying everything. Should we call someone? The city? The news?" Miranda's jaw tightened. She didn't answer immediately, her focus fixed on the excavator as its bucket swung back and forth, leaving deep gouges in the siding of the house. The operator seemed hesitant, as if he understood the gravity of what he was doing, but Wilson's imperious gestures from the side kept him going. Miranda felt a surge of determination. The damage was already done, but she wasn't going to let it escalate further without consequences. She turned to Reggie. "Don't call anyone just yet," she said firmly, though her voice carried a hint of urgency. "I've already documented enough to escalate this myself. Just make sure everyone stays out of harm's way." Reggie nodded, his face pale but resolute. He motioned for the other workers to move further away from the house, where they clustered near the sidewalk, muttering angrily among themselves. Miranda knew their frustration mirrored her own, but she also knew she couldn't afford to lose control. Wilson wanted her to react impulsively. He wanted her to make a mistake that he could use against her. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Wilson, meanwhile, was reveling in the destruction. He stood with his arms crossed, a smug grin plastered across his face as he barked occasional orders at the operator. "That's it. Rip out that wall, looks like it's about to collapse anyway," he shouted, laughing as another section of the house crumbled under the excavator's assault. It was clear he had no real justification for his actions, only a perverse sense of power. Miranda took a deep breath and stepped closer to him, her phone still recording. "Officer Wilson," she said, her tone icy but composed. "You're fully aware that what you're doing here is illegal. There's no court order, no verified claim of hazard, and no warrant. You're operating entirely outside the bounds of your authority." Wilson barely glanced at her, his smirk unwavering. "Lady, I don't need a lecture about authority. I'm protecting this neighborhood. This property's a hazard, and I've got the city's backing to clean it up. So why don't you step aside and let me do my job?" Miranda took another step forward, her calm demeanor masking the storm of rage she felt brewing inside. "This isn't your job," she said sharply. "Your job is to uphold the law, not to demolish private property on a whim. You're abusing your position, and you know it." Wilson's expression darkened slightly, but he quickly recovered, doubling down on his arrogance. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "but I've been on this force long enough to know when someone's hiding something. You think you can fool me with your fancy words and fake indignation? Not a chance." Miranda's patience was wearing thin, but she forced herself to stay composed. "You've already caused extensive damage to this property," she said, her voice steady but firm. "If you don't stop this immediately, you'll be facing charges for destruction of property, unlawful use of city equipment, and a host of other violations." Wilson laughed, a harsh, grating sound that only fueled Miranda's resolve. "Charges? From who?" "You? Lady, you don't scare me. I've seen your type before, always thinking you can talk your way out of trouble. But let me tell you something. I'm the one in charge here, and I say this place is getting cleared." At that moment, the excavator operator hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. He looked uncertain, glancing back at Wilson as if seeking confirmation. The delay caused Wilson's irritation to flare. "What are you waiting for?" he barked. "I told you to take it down. Finish the job, or I'll find someone who will." The operator hesitated a moment longer, then reluctantly resumed his work. The excavator's bucket slammed into another section of the house, sending a shower of wood and plaster raining down. Miranda clenched her fists, her heart pounding as she realized she needed to act fast. This wasn't just about stopping the destruction, it was about exposing Wilson for what he was, a reckless, prejudiced bully who had no badges wearing a badge. She turned and approached one of the workers, a young man named Eric, who had been filming the scene on his phone. "Eric, send me that footage," she said quickly. "And make sure you keep a copy for yourself." Eric nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he tapped at his phone. "This is insane," he muttered. "He's going to ruin everything." Miranda's expression softened briefly. "Not if I can help it," she said. "Just stay clear and let me handle this." As Eric sent her the footage, Miranda's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen and saw an incoming call from the precinct. She stepped away from the noise of the machinery and answered. "Chief Hall," came the voice of Captain Daniels, one of the more reliable officers in the department. "We've got reports of an incident at your address. Is everything okay?" Miranda hesitated for a split second, then made a decision. "No, it's not," she said curtly. "I need you to get down here immediately. Bring backup, and make sure someone from Internal Affairs is on the line. We've got a serious situation involving Officer Wilson." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Understood, Chief," Daniel said. "We're on our way." Miranda ended the call and turned back toward the scene. The excavator had paused again, this time because the operator appeared to be arguing with one of the workers, who had stepped into his line of sight. Wilson was yelling at both of them now, his face red with frustration. "Get out of the way!" he shouted, gesturing wildly. "This is official business. You're interfering with an active operation." The worker stood his ground, his arms crossed defiantly. "This isn't right," he said, his voice firm. "You're destroying someone's home for no reason. You've gone too far." Wilson stormed over to the man, his hand twitching toward the baton at his belt. "I'm not going to tell you again," he growled. "Move, or you'll be under arrest for obstruction." Miranda's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough, Wilson." He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone mocking. "You don't get to tell me what's enough." Miranda stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Actually, I do," she said coldly. "And you're about to find out why." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Wilson's face. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the distant sound of sirens reached their ears. Miranda allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The cavalry was coming, and Wilson's reign of destruction was about to come to an abrupt end. The sound of sirens grew louder, piercing through the chaotic scene like a sharp blade. Miranda stood firm near the shattered remains of her house, her arms crossed as she watched Officer Wilson pace nervously. His previous bravado was beginning to crack. He hadn't anticipated this level of scrutiny, especially so soon. The excavator operator had turned off the machine, stepping out of the cab and moving to the side, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. The workers had retreated to the far end of the property, whispering among themselves and casting wary glances at Wilson, whose temper seemed to hang by a thread. When the first patrol car pulled up, Captain Daniels stepped out, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the wreckage. His jaw tightened, and he adjusted his duty belt as he walked briskly toward the scene. 2 more vehicles followed, and several officers filed out, looking unsure of what to do as they saw their colleagues standing amid the destruction. Daniels locked eyes with Miranda, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, though he maintained his professional composure. "Chief Hall," Daniels said, his tone respectful but urgent. "I received your call. What's going on here?" Miranda didn't waste time with pleasantries. She gestured toward the partially demolished house, her voice steady but edged with anger. "What's going on is a blatant abuse of power by Officer Wilson. He has illegally brought in city equipment to destroy private property without a warrant, court order, or any legitimate cause. He's endangered lives and caused significant damage to a property I own." The revelation that this was her house hit Daniels like a freight train. His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly schooled his expression. "Understood," he said, his voice calm but clipped. He turned to Wilson, who was now standing rigidly, his face a mix of defiance and unease. "Wilson," Daniels said, his tone shifting to one of command. "Explain yourself. Why is this equipment here? And why have you taken it upon yourself to demolish this house?" Wilson straightened, his jaw set as he attempted to regain his footing. "Captain, I received a report of unlicensed construction and a potentially unsafe structure. I acted within my authority to address the issue and ensure public safety." Daniel's gaze was icy. "Unlicensed construction? Unsafe structure? Did you verify this claim through the proper channels before taking action? Where is the documentation authorizing the use of this equipment?" Wilson hesitated, his bravado faltering. "The situation required immediate action," he said defensively. "There wasn't time to go through all the red tape. This neighborhood has seen plenty of illegal activity, and I wasn't about to let something slide just because." "Just because what?" Miranda cut in sharply, stepping forward. Her eyes locked on Wilson, and for the first time he looked genuinely unnerved. Because you assumed someone like me didn't belong here. Because you thought you could act with impunity in a neighborhood you clearly have no respect for. Your excuses are as flimsy as your actions, Wilson. Daniels raised a hand, silencing them both. That's enough, he said firmly. He turned to one of the officers standing nearby. Secure the scene. No one touches anything else until we've documented every detail. I want photos, statements from witnesses, and a full report by the end of the day. The officers nodded and began moving to comply, their movements efficient but tense. Wilson's face reddened with frustration as he watched his colleagues essentially sideline him. He turned back to Daniels, his voice rising. You're taking her side without even hearing me out. This is ridiculous. I was doing my job. Your job, Daniels said coldly, is to uphold the law, not to twist it to suit your biases. This isn't the first time your judgment has been called into question, Wilson, but it may very well be the last. Miranda stepped closer, her tone calm but cutting. You've already caused irreparable damage, not just to my property, but to the credibility of this department. And let me make something very clear. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior under my watch. Wilson blinked, confusion flashing across his face. Your watch? He repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. What are you talking about? Ah. It was Daniels who answered, his voice heavy with meaning. Chief Hall is your new commanding officer, Wilson. You just destroyed the home of the chief of police. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The workers, the officers, even the bystanders who had begun to gather at the edges of the property all fell silent. Wilson's face drained of color, his bravado finally crumbling under the weight of what he had done. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The reality of his actions crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. Miranda didn't let the moment linger. She turned to Daniels. Captain, I want him removed from this scene immediately. He is to have no further involvement in this matter. An internal affairs investigation will begin today, and I expect full cooperation from every member of this department. Daniels nodded sharply. Understood, Chief. He motioned to two officers, who approached Wilson cautiously. Wilson raised his hands, his voice rising in desperation. Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. You can't do this, I was just trying to do my job. Miranda's expression was like stone. Your job doesn't involve bulldozing someone's home on a hunch, Wilson. You acted recklessly, violated multiple protocols, and let your prejudices dictate your actions. There will be consequences. The officers escorted Wilson away from the scene, his protests fading into the background as the full weight of the situation settled over the gathered crowd. Miranda turned back to Daniels, who was already issuing orders to the remaining officers. I want every piece of evidence catalogued, she said firmly. And make sure to speak with the workers, they've witnessed everything. Daniels nodded again, his respect for Miranda evident. We'll handle it, Chief. You have my word. Miranda sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. She looked around at what was left of her house, the torn siding, the shattered windows, the piles of debris that had once been walls. It wasn't just a house, it was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where she could plant roots in this new city. Now, it was a symbol of the very challenges she had come here to confront. One of the workers approached her hesitantly. It was Reggie, the man who had been painting earlier. He held a small, battered metal box in his hands, his expression somber. I found this in the rubble, he said softly, holding it out to her. Figured it might be important. Miranda took the box, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She opened it carefully, revealing a collection of personal mementos, family photos, a small stack of letters, and a medal she had received years ago for bravery in the line of duty. The sight of it all brought a lump to her throat, but she swallowed it down, refusing to let her emotions show. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I appreciate it." Reggie nodded and stepped back, giving her space. Miranda closed the box and held it tightly, her resolve hardening. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Wilson's actions had been reckless and destructive, but they had also exposed a deeper rot within the department, one she was determined to root out. She looked up at the officers still working to secure the scene and then at the workers who had gathered nearby, their faces a mix of anger and hope. She would rebuild her house, her department, and the trust that had been shattered in this city. And she would do it with the same unyielding determination that had brought her here in the first place. Miranda turned to Daniels, her voice calm but resolute. "Let's get to work." The silence that followed Wilson's removal from the scene was brief and brittle, like the calm before another storm. Miranda watched as the two officers escorted him to a patrol car parked farther down the street. He was still protesting, his voice rising and falling with a mix of desperation and disbelief. The crowd, which had grown as word of the incident spread, murmured in hushed tones, their eyes shifting between the wreckage of Miranda's house and the retreating figure of Wilson. She could feel their unease, their confusion. They didn't yet know the full story, and rumors were no doubt already swirling. Captain Daniels stood nearby, issuing orders with a clipped efficiency. Officers moved to secure the scene, taping off the area and documenting the damage. The excavator operator, pale and shaken, stood to the side, nervously wringing his hands as he answered questions from another officer. Miranda could tell he hadn't realized the full extent of Wilson's overreach when he'd agreed to operate the machine. Still, ignorance wouldn't absolve him entirely. Miranda remained composed, but inside her frustration was mounting. The destruction of her house was egregious enough, but the deeper implications of Wilson's actions gnawed at her. This wasn't just a case of one rogue officer acting out, it was a symptom of a larger systemic problem. She had suspected as much when she'd taken the job, but seeing it manifest so blatantly was infuriating. Daniels approached her, his expression grim but professional. "Chief," he began, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard by the gathered crowd. "We've started taking statements from the workers and documenting the damage. I've also contacted Internal Affairs. They'll be sending someone over shortly to begin a formal investigation." "Good," Miranda said curtly. She glanced toward the patrol car where Wilson now sat, his head lowered as he stared at the dashboard. "Has he said anything useful?" Daniels shook his head. "Mostly excuses. He's claiming he acted out of concern for public safety and insists he had verbal approval from the city to bring in the excavator. We're verifying that claim now, but I highly doubt it checks out." "It won't," Miranda said with certainty. "He acted entirely on his own authority, or lack thereof. Make sure the city is aware of what he's done. I don't want them blindsided when this goes public." Daniels nodded. "Understood. What about the crowd?" He gestured subtly toward the growing number of onlookers. "They're getting restless. A few of them have been asking questions about who you are and why this is happening." Miranda's jaw tightened. She had deliberately kept a low profile since arriving in the city, avoiding the kind of attention that might make her job harder. But now, with her home in ruins and Wilson's actions already causing a stir, she knew that anonymity was no longer an option. The situation demanded transparency, even if it meant exposing herself to greater scrutiny. "I'll address them," she said, her voice steady. "But not yet. Let's finish securing the scene and gathering evidence first. I want this handled by the book." Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "All right. I'll make sure the officers know to keep things calm." As Daniels walked away, Miranda took a moment to steady herself. She looked at the remains of her house, the splintered wood and shattered glass that had once held the promise of a new beginning. It was a sobering sight, but she refused to let it break her. This wasn't the end of the story, it was a turning point. And if Wilson thought he could walk away from this unscathed, he was sorely mistaken. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another car, this one bearing the insignia of Internal Affairs. A man in a crisp suit stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before landing on Miranda. He approached with measured steps, his expression one of professional detachment. "Chief Hall," he said, extending a hand. "Detective Michael Avery, Internal Affairs. I was briefed on the situation on my way over. I'd like to hear your account of what happened." Miranda shook his hand, appreciating his no-nonsense demeanor. "Detective Avery, I'm glad you're here. This situation is already escalating, and I need it handled thoroughly and transparently." "Of course," Avery said. He pulled out a notebook and pen, his gaze steady. "Let's start from the beginning. What led to this incident?" Miranda recounted the events in detail, starting with Wilson's initial arrival at the property and his baseless accusations. She described his dismissal of her documentation, his unauthorized use of the excavator, and his blatant disregard for protocol. Avery listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes but mostly letting her speak without interruption. When she finished, he closed his notebook and nodded. "Thank you, Chief. That's a clear and thorough account. We'll corroborate it with the statements from the workers and other witnesses. Based on what you've described, it seems Wilson acted well outside the bounds of his authority. He didn't just overstep," Miranda said, her tone sharp. "He weaponized his position to act on personal biases. This wasn't about public safety, it was about power and prejudice. And it's not just him. Officers like Wilson don't operate in isolation. They thrive in environments that enable their behavior. That's what needs to change." Avery met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Understood. I'll make sure that's reflected in my report." As Avery turned to speak with Daniels, Miranda felt a faint glimmer of hope. The process would be slow and arduous, but at least it was moving in the right direction. Still, the damage had already been done, and the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Her attention shifted back to the crowd, which had grown larger in the time since Avery's arrival. Some of the onlookers were taking photos or recording videos, their curiosity mingling with indignation as they tried to piece together what had happened. Miranda knew she couldn't delay addressing them much longer. The longer they were left in the dark, the more room there was for misinformation to spread. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her presence immediately drawing the attention of the crowd. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned to her as she stood near the edge of the property, the wreckage of her house visible behind her. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "My name is Miranda Hall. I am the chief of police for this city. What you see here is the result of an unacceptable abuse of power by one of our officers, Officer Harry Wilson." The crowd stirred at her words, surprise and outrage rippling through the gathered onlookers. Miranda continued, her tone firm but measured. "Officer Wilson acted without proper authority, using city resources to destroy private property under false pretenses. His actions were reckless, unjustified, and in direct violation of departmental policy. I want to assure you that this matter is being taken extremely seriously. Internal Affairs has already begun an investigation, and Wilson will be held accountable for his actions." A voice from the crowd called out, "Why'd he do it? What made him think he could get away with this?" Miranda met the speaker's gaze, her expression grave. "Because he believed no one would stop him. He believed his position gave him the right to act without oversight or consequence. That belief is exactly what we must root out, not just in him, but in the culture that allowed it to flourish. Another voice chimed in. You're saying this is bigger than just one cop? Yes, Miranda said unequivocally. It is. This incident is a symptom of a larger problem, one that we cannot ignore. My job as chief of police is to ensure that every officer in this department is held to the highest standards of integrity and accountability. And I promise you, I will not rest until that promise is fulfilled. The crowd erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs, their initial shock giving way to a sense of cautious optimism. Miranda felt the weight of their expectations settle on her shoulders, but she welcomed it. This was why she had taken the job, to face challenges like this head-on and to make real, lasting change. As the crowd began to disperse, Miranda turned back to the scene, her resolve stronger than ever. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she was ready to face it. One way or another, justice would prevail. The air around the wreckage of Miranda's home felt heavy with tension as the investigation deepened. Officers moved efficiently to collect evidence, snapping photos, taking measurements, and cataloging every detail of the destruction. Detective Avery, the internal affairs investigator, worked methodically, interviewing witnesses and reviewing footage provided by the workers and Miranda herself. Each passing moment felt like a step closer to exposing the full scope of Wilson's recklessness. Miranda stood near what remained of the house, her arms crossed tightly as she surveyed the damage. A part of her wanted to let the emotions of the day overtake her, to cry for the home she'd envisioned, now lying in ruins. But there was no time for that. This wasn't just about her personal loss. It was about ensuring that officers like Wilson were held accountable. She had come to this city to reform its police force, and this incident would be a defining moment in that fight. A sudden commotion drew her attention. Several officers near the patrol car where Wilson had been detained were raising their voices. Miranda's brow furrowed as she made her way over, her heels crunching on the gravel-strewn ground. As she approached, she saw Wilson, now outside the car, gesturing animatedly as he argued with the officers. "You can't do this to me." Wilson's voice was sharp, filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I've served this department for years. This is a setup, and you all know it." One of the officers, a younger man with an uneasy expression, tried to calm him. "Officer Wilson, we've been instructed to keep you here until the investigation is complete. Please cooperate." "Cooperate?" Wilson spat, his face reddening. "I'm being treated like a damn criminal while this whole thing is blown out of proportion. She's lying this is a power play, and you idiots are falling for it." Miranda stepped forward, her presence cutting through the argument like a blade. The officers straightened instinctively, their eyes shifting to her. Wilson froze mid-rant, his gaze locking onto hers. For a moment, his bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But then his defiance returned, and he sneered. "Oh, here she is," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The big boss herself. Come to gloat, Chief." Miranda didn't flinch. Her voice was calm but steely as she addressed him. "No, Officer Wilson. I'm here to ensure justice is served. Something you clearly have no understanding of." Wilson's sneer deepened, but she didn't give him the chance to respond. She turned to Detective Avery, who had followed her to the scene. "Detective, has the city confirmed whether Wilson had authorization for any of this?" Avery nodded grimly. "They've denied any involvement. No permits, no orders, nothing. He acted entirely on his own. In fact, they're preparing a formal complaint against him for unauthorized use of city equipment." Miranda's lips pressed into a thin line as she nodded. "Good. That'll make the next steps clear." Wilson's voice cut in, rising with indignation. "This is bullshit. I was protecting this community. That house was a danger, and I did what needed to be done. You're turning this into some political circus to make me look bad." Miranda turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "Protecting the community," she said softly, her voice laced with disbelief. "By destroying illegally owned property without cause, by ignoring every protocol and violating the trust this community has in us? No, Wilson. What you did wasn't about protection. It was about your ego, your biases, and your inability to see past them." Wilson's face twisted with anger. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Miranda shot back, her tone sharpening. "I know you've faced multiple complaints for excessive force and discriminatory behavior. I know you've been reprimanded more times than any officer in this department should be allowed to. And I know that today you proved beyond any doubt that you are unfit to wear that badge." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, even Wilson seemed at a loss for how to respond. The gathered officers exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. Miranda let the silence linger, making sure her message sank in before she turned to Avery. "Detective, I want Officer Wilson taken into custody," she said firmly. "Charge him with destruction of property, misuse of city resources, and any other applicable violations. Ensure he's placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation." Wilson's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious." Miranda's gaze was unwavering. "Dead serious. You crossed every line today, Wilson, and you will face the consequences." The officers flanking Wilson moved to escort him toward another patrol car, but he resisted, yanking his arm away from one of them. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice echoing through the night. "You think you're better than me? You think you're going to change anything? You're just another suit pretending to care about the rules." Miranda didn't react to his outburst. She watched as he was finally subdued and placed into the car, the door slamming shut with a finality that seemed to mark the end of his reign of impunity. But she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Detective Avery stepped closer, his expression serious. "Chief, with your permission, I'll oversee the transport and make sure everything's handled properly on our end." "Thank you, Detective," Miranda said, her tone softening slightly. "I appreciate your diligence." As Avery departed with the car carrying Wilson, Miranda turned back to the scene. The crowd had thinned, but a few onlookers remained, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. She approached the workers, who were still standing near the edge of the property, their tools abandoned in the grass. "Reggie," she said, addressing the foreman, "I want to thank you and your team for your cooperation tonight. I'll make sure you're compensated for the work you've done, and for any losses you've incurred because of this." Reggie nodded, his face lined with weariness. "Thank you, Chief. We just want to see this kind of thing stop. People around here deserve better than what we've been getting." "They do," Miranda agreed. "And I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure they get it." As the workers began to disperse, Miranda remained standing near the wreckage of her house. The night had grown quiet, the earlier chaos fading into the background, but the weight of the day's events still pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew the fight for justice in this city wouldn't end with Wilson's arrest. It was a long road ahead, one that would require persistence, resilience, and the support of the very community she had come to serve. Miranda took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She would rebuild not just her house, but the trust and integrity of this department. Tonight had been a turning point, and she intended to ensure that the momentum carried forward. No more officers like Wilson. No more abuses of power. This city deserved better, and she would deliver. The days following Wilson's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. News of the incident spread quickly, sparking heated discussions across the city. Though Miranda had kept the initial investigation contained, The sheer scale of the destruction and the gravity of Wilson's actions made it impossible to avoid public scrutiny. By the end of the week, the story was on every local news channel, with headlines calling for accountability and reform within the police department. For Miranda, the aftermath was a balancing act. On one hand, she needed to maintain control of the investigation and ensure that Wilson faced justice. On the other, she had to address the community's anger and frustration, a sentiment that had been simmering long before this incident, but was now boiling over. She spent long hours coordinating with internal affairs, city officials, and her command staff, all while preparing to face the public in a way that inspired confidence rather than despair. The day of the public address arrived sooner than Miranda would have liked, but she knew delaying it any further would only erode trust. A podium had been set up outside City Hall, flanked by the flags of the state and the city. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and hope. Miranda stood behind the podium, dressed in her formal uniform, the badge on her chest gleaming in the afternoon sun. Beside her were Captain Daniels and Detective Avery, both of whom had been instrumental in managing the fallout from Wilson's actions. As the murmurs of the crowd quieted, Miranda stepped forward. Her posture was straight, her expression calm but serious. She knew the importance of this moment. It wasn't just about addressing the damage done by one officer. It was about showing the city that she was committed to real change. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying clearly over the assembled crowd. "My name is Miranda Hall, and I am the Chief of Police for this city. I want to thank you all for being here today. What happened earlier this week was an egregious abuse of power by one of our officers, and I want to address it directly." She paused, letting her words settle. The crowd was silent, their attention fixed on her. On that day, Officer Harry Wilson acted recklessly and without authority. He destroyed private property, endangered lives, and violated the trust that this community has placed in its police department. Let me be clear, his actions were not only unacceptable, they were unlawful. He has been arrested and is facing multiple charges, including destruction of property, misuse of city resources, and abuse of power. There was a murmur of approval from the crowd, but Miranda didn't let it distract her. She continued, her tone growing firmer. "However, this is not just about one officer. What happened that day is a symptom of a larger issue, an issue that has plagued this department for far too long. There are officers who believe they are above the law, who use their positions to intimidate and harm rather than to protect and serve. That ends now." The crowd's reaction grew louder, a mixture of applause and calls for accountability. Miranda raised a hand, signaling for quiet, and the noise subsided. "As your Chief of Police, I am committed to ensuring that this department is held to the highest standards of integrity and accountability. To that end, I am implementing the following measures, effective immediately. First, we are launching a full-scale review of all complaints against officers within this department, focusing on patterns of misconduct and abuse. Second, we are instituting mandatory bias training for every member of this force, from the newest recruits to the most senior officers. Third, we will increase transparency in our disciplinary process, ensuring that the public has a clearer understanding of how we address misconduct." She paused again, her eyes scanning the crowd. "These are just the first steps. Real change takes time, but it also takes trust. And I am asking you, the members of this community, to hold us accountable. Your voices matter. Your experiences matter. Together we can build a department that truly serves and protects every member of this city, without exception." The applause this time was loud and sustained, rippling through the crowd like a wave. Miranda felt a surge of relief, though she knew the hardest work was still ahead. Winning back the trust of a community that had been failed so many times before would not be easy, but she was determined to try. As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached Miranda to shake her hand or express their support. One of them was Reggie, the foreman who had been working on her house the day of the incident. His handshake was firm, his expression one of gratitude. "Thank you for standing up to him," Reggie said. "A lot of us have been waiting for someone to do that for a long time." Miranda nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "I'm just getting started. People like Wilson have gotten away with too much for too long. It's time to change that." Later that evening, Miranda returned to what remained of her house. The debris had been cleared, but the structure was still a shell of what it had been. She stood in the middle of the open living room, the walls around her bare and exposed. The silence was heavy, but it gave her space to think. Detective Avery arrived not long after, carrying a manila folder. "Chief," he said, handing her the folder. "I thought you'd want to see this. It's the preliminary report from Internal Affairs." Miranda opened the folder and scanned the contents. As expected, it painted a damning picture of Wilson's actions, not just on the day of the incident, but throughout his career. Multiple complaints, repeated warnings, and a pattern of behavior that should have disqualified him from wearing a badge years ago. She felt a pang of anger at the system that had allowed him to remain in uniform for so long. "This confirms what we already knew," she said, her voice steady. "He's a symptom of a much bigger problem." Avery nodded. "Agreed. But his arrest and the changes you've announced are a good start. People are noticing." Miranda closed the folder and set it aside. "Noticing isn't enough. We need to keep pushing. This department has to change, or we're just going to end up back where we started." Avery offered a faint smile. "With you leading the charge, I don't think that's going to happen." Miranda didn't respond immediately. She looked around the empty room, the faint echo of her own footsteps on the floorboards reminding her of the work still to be done both here and within the department. "We'll rebuild," she said finally, more to herself than to Avery. "The house, the department, the trust we've lost. We'll rebuild it all." And as the sun set over the city, casting long shadows over the fractured remains of her home, Miranda felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning.